Hey folks, tonight we're stepping into a world that smells like old ale-singed hair and regret. Yes, it's time to visit the medieval tavern once again. But this time we're not here for just the cosy fire or the off-key bard in the corner. No, tonight we're looking at the darker side. What happened when the mead went sour, when the gambler lost everything, or when that fourth tankard tipped you into trouble. Before we get started, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy winding down with strange stories from history. Drop a comment to let me know what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a soft fan for background hum, and let's wander into a place where drinking could be the most dangerous thing you did all week. The tavern door swung open with the kind of creak that made your spine tense before your boots even crossed the threshold, the kind of sound that whispered you were entering a place where stories clung to the walls like cobwebs, and the air was heavy with heat hops and hints of past arguments. Inside it was chaos wrapped in comfort. The hearth spat soft embers into the low-lit haze, casting flickering shadows on faces that had lived too long and drunk too deep. Tables groaned beneath the weight of elbows and tankards. Boots scraped stone floors worn smooth by decades of stomping, and voices collided in mid-air like drunks in a narrow alley. This was not a gentle place. It was not built for poetry or manners. It was built for survival, for ale, thicker than soup for dice that were never quite fair, for songs, sung off-key by men too far gone to care. The moment you stepped in, you belonged to it, whether you wanted to or not. The scent hit first, a layered perfume of damp wool, roasted meat, sweat unwashed feet, and the unmistakable tang of something fermenting in a back room no one had entered in years. Then came the sounds, as din of slurred declarations, off-tune bards clinking pewter, and the occasional thud that could either be a chair falling or someone being reminded of their debt with a fist. No one looked up when you entered. That was part of the ritual. You came in unnoticed, or you didn't come in at all. Eye contact meant challenge or worse conversation, so you kept your head down, scanned for an open seat that wasn't sticky for reasons you couldn't guess, and tried not to trip over the hound snoring beside the fire like he owned the place, and maybe he did. The tavern had rules, but they weren't written. You learned them the hard way, one mistake at a time. You learned not to touch a mug that wasn't yours, not to sit at the table with the dented shield unless you were willing to lose a tooth, not to flirt with the girl who poured the drinks, unless you wanted to taste the barrel her father kept behind the bar. You learned that kindness came in strange shapes, a crust of bread from a man who hadn't spoken in an hour, a warning growl from a woman whose knife you hadn't seen until she tapped the hilt twice on the wood. And you learned that the only thing more dangerous than an angry drunk was a quiet one. The mug in your hand was both shield and weapon. Raise it too fast and you seemed eager. Raise it too slow and you seemed afraid. But raise it just right. Nod at the man beside you. Sip without grimacing and you might earn a sliver of peace. The first drink was never the problem. It was the third. The one that made old regrets surface and bad ideas seem heroic. The one that made hands twitch toward coin purses and voices rise just a little too loud. That was when the tavern watched. Not with eyes, but with a silence that dropped like a blade. That was when the alewife stood a little straighter. When the dog lifted one ear, when the bard shifted to a slower tune, the tavern was alive in those moments. Breathing, waiting, and it always knew how to handle trouble. Sometimes with laughter, sometimes with force, but always with memory. It remembered who threw the first punch and who cleaned up the blood. It remembered who helped the limping man to the door and who kicked him when he fell. It remembered everything. So, you drank carefully. Not too fast, not too slow. You listened to stories that may have been true once and lies that had been polished until they shone. You nodded when someone mentioned the war, the bad harvest, the taxes. You kept your back to the wall and your purse under your belt. And as the night deepened and the fire burned lower, you realized something strange. You felt safe, not in the way a child feels under a blanket, but in the way a wolf feels among its own kind. You belonged here, not because the tavern welcomed you, but because it didn't spit you out. And in a world where danger waited behind every door, that was more than enough. By the time the second mug slid across the table into your grasp, the tavern had changed. Or perhaps it was you. The air felt warmer, the bench less splintery. The walls seemed to breathe in sync with the fire. You hadn't quite reached the point of hallucination, but your senses had certainly started a slow, cheerful rebellion. Everything was funny. Or it would be if your head wasn't already wobbling slightly on your neck like a poorly balanced pumpkin. You raised the mug, and with that first sip of round 2, you realised that the real danger in a medieval tavern wasn't getting into a fight. It was what you drank when you didn't ask enough questions. This mug tasted different. Not different as in complex. Not different as in layered with notes of spice or honey. Different as in confusing. Like someone had attempted to ferment oatmeal in sadness. Your tongue recoiled, your throat braced, and still you swallowed. Because that's what you did. Complaining got you labelled soft, refusing to finish. Got you mocked. And besides, it was already paid for. Probably, maybe you weren't entirely sure anymore. The tavern keeper, a square woman with arms carved from tree trunks, eyed you from across the room. Her look was not one of sympathy. She was waiting to see if you flinched, if you gagged, if you collapsed. You met her eyes and nodded. She grunted and turned back to whatever alchemical procedure she was performing behind the bar with a bucket, a candle, and what looked like an eel. That's when the twitching started. Not yours, thankfully, but the man to your left. He took a swig of something thick and syrupy from a greenish mug and immediately blinked 12 times in a row. Then he smacked his lips as if trying to figure out if they were still there. He sniffed, he coughed. He let out a satisfied sigh, and then he passed out face first into his bowl of turnips. No one reacted. The bard didn't miss a note. The gambler across the room didn't pause his story about cheating a merchant out of a goat and 2/3 of a wheel of cheese. The dog under the table shifted slightly to avoid the man's boots. It was business as usual. Because here's the truth about drinks in a medieval tavern, they weren't standardised. There were no licenses, no safety inspections, no brewing schools. What you got in your mug depended on who was working that day, what ingredients were lying around and how brave or desperate they were feeling. Some taverns brewed their own stuff in the back using ancient recipes scratched into stone or whispered by candlelight. Others bought barrels from wandering sellers who promised that the frothy contents had been blessed by monks and filtered through virgin wool. Spoiler alert, they weren't. The ingredients varied wildly. Sometimes you got barley, sometimes rye, sometimes whatever grain was left unmolested by rats that week. Hops rare, expensive, mostly ignored. For sweetness, honey or old fruit was used for bite nettles or wormwood or even pepper, and for fermentation, whatever yeast happened to be drifting through the air, which in a room full of sweaty farmers and aging dogs might not have been ideal. But no one cared. Or rather, they cared right up until the 4th sip. After that, the warmth hit your belly, the world tilted slightly, and it no longer mattered what you were drinking, only that it was still wet and vaguely alcoholic. Of course, the results varied. One batch might make you cheerful and chatty, another might knock you out cold in under 10 minutes. A third might cause hallucinations, digestive distress, or temporary loss of your peripheral vision. The risk was part of the ritual, and if you managed to stay upright and coherent until your mug was empty, you earned respect, at least until the next round. Sometimes drinks had names. Names like Gutburner Threefinger, Cider Blind Monk's Mead, or the infamous Devil's Elbow, which was less a beverage and more of a dare. These names weren't jokes. They were warnings. You ordered them, not because you liked the taste, but because you wanted the story. You wanted to be the one who survived it, who laughed in the face of bad brewing and lived to stagger out the door with both shoes still on. Taverns that developed a reputation for strong drinks became pilgrimage sites for local lunatics and travelling fools. People came from miles around to sample the legendary brews. Some claimed they could taste the history in every sip. Others just liked the way it made their ears ring for 3 days. And then there were the custom orders. You could walk into the right tavern and say something like, "Give me the stuff you save for the tax collector," and they'd nod grimly and reach for a dusty jug under the counter. That drink might arrive in a cup with a cracked rim and steam rising from its surface. It might hiss, it might bubble, it might even move, but you drink it because your pride depended on it, because the eyes of the room were on you. Because in a world that offered few victories, finishing a terrifying beverage was something you could own. Of course there were consequences, terrible, relentless consequences. You might sweat through your shirt within 5 minutes. Your speech might slur into an entirely new dialect. Your stomach might revolt halfway through a bard's ballad, and still the tavern would not flinch. Someone would pat your back, someone else would steal your coin purse, and the bard would rhyme wretch with wretch and continue singing. The real veterans, though, weren't the loudest or the drunkest. They were the quiet ones who knew the signs, who swirled the mug, sniffed it and tilted it, just enough to let a single drop touch their tongue. They knew which barrels to avoid, which drinks were safe-ish, which ones to recommend to travellers who asked too many questions. They weren't mean, just practical. They had survived too many nights, too many brews, too many friends who didn't know when to stop. And so the mug came back around your turn again. The liquid inside had changed colour, or maybe the light had changed, or maybe your vision had. Still you drank, not because it was smart, not because it was pleasant, but because the tavern asked it of you, because the night was still young, because the fire was warm, the songs were catchy, and your place at the table was not yet earned. It burned. Of course it did, it always burned. And you smiled through it. By the time your fourth drink rolled around, something curious happened. You stopped questioning what was in the mug and started questioning reality instead. The walls of the tavern seemed to exhale. The ceiling, a patchwork of soot-darkened beams and hanging garlic braids, appeared to sway gently like a cradle suspended by thick ropes. The voices around you melted into one indistinct river of sound, and the distinction between song argument and storytelling vanished altogether. It was in this fogged mental state that you heard it, a tale being spun near the hearth, delivered by a man who looked more chimney than human. Soot-covered eyes gleaming and wrapped in a cloak that might once have been a curtain, he told of a mug, a very specific mug. This mug he claimed was ancient, older than the tavern itself. Carved from bone and rimmed in tarnished silver, it was said to bring visions. Not the delightful kind, mind you, but warnings. Those who drank from it dreamed of wolves in churchyards, shadows beneath wheat fields, and their own hands doing things they wouldn't remember by morning. Some laughed, others shivered. You looked around, half expecting to see someone clutching this cursed vessel. And then you did. A man 3 benches away, unmoving eyes locked on the flames, his knuckles white around a pale, bone-coloured cup. It might have been coincidence, or it might have been one of those tavern truths that only made sense when you were 4 ales deep. But no one approached him, and when he left, they didn't speak until the door shut fully behind him. The tavern held its breath, then burst into noise again louder than before, as if to chase something unseen away. It wasn't just cursed mugs that worried the regulars. Communal drinking vessels were a danger of their own. Most taverns weren't equipped with more than a mismatched collection of earthenware jugs, cracked wooden bowls, and the occasional pewter cup with a dent the size of a goose egg. Patrons didn't get their own mugs. Drinks arrived in whatever container was cleanish. You were expected to pass it along when you were done, or at least when you could no longer lift it. The concept of hygiene was spiritual more than scientific. If the Lord didn't strike you down after drinking from the same mug as a man with 4 visible sores, then clearly you were favoured. The mugs were rarely washed between uses, maybe rinsed in a trough out back if they were lucky. Most were wiped with whatever was available, a barkeep's apron, a sleeve, or the rag used earlier to mop up a spill that no one had the courage to identify. This created a kind of ritualistic gamble. Each sip carried not just alcohol but the invisible roulette of infection, pox, rot, or something local and unnamed. The bravest drinkers claimed that the alcohol killed everything. The wiser ones didn't drink at all unless they'd brought their own cup, which marked them as either paranoid or noble, sometimes both. And yet there was a strange camaraderie in it. People bonded over shared risk. You drank from a grimy clay jug and then clinked it against someone else's iron tankard, as if declaring yourselves brothers in bad judgment. A single, communal bowl of ale might circle an entire table. By the end of it, everyone was family, loud, clumsy, suspiciously sweaty family. But with shared drink came shared drama. If someone skipped their turn or spilled the ale tensions brewed, you could insult a man's mother, his mule, or even his gods, but waste a drink and you had a problem. The most common fights in taverns weren't about politics or land or women. They were about someone drinking too much of what wasn't theirs. It didn't matter if it was cheap swill or highborn honeymead. Once passed around, it became sacred. Some patrons devised clever ways to avoid passing the drink along a well-timed fake sneeze, a sudden declaration of sickness, or pretending to fall asleep with the mug still in hand. One man legend had it tied the mug to his belt with a leather strap and claimed he had been cursed to never let go of it or his crops would fail. It worked, until he actually tried to go to the privy. The danger wasn't limited to germs and grudges. There were subtler threats too. Spiked drinks weren't uncommon, not necessarily with poisons, but with things that made you malleable. sleepy open to suggestion, a tincture of poppy seed, a drop of oil from some traveller's satchel. It only took a few moments of distraction. You left your mug unattended, returned to find it refilled, and took it as a kindness. But kindness was a rare currency in places like this. Then of course came the hallucinogens, unofficial, unintended, but very real mouldy grains, fermented fruit that had begun to go fuzzy, brewing barrels left out in the sun too long. Some tavern keepers experimented with herbs to create signature flavours, but not all herbs played nice. A bit too much henbane, and your customers started seeing wolves wearing hats. A touch of belladonna, and your bard tried to dance with the fire. People stumbled out of these taverns claiming to have met saints, fought devils, or conversed with the moon. And maybe they had. The real world was already strange enough. Add half a gallon of peasant-made mead, and it turned into a travelling circus. There was a reason many towns had laws about drinking too early in the day, not because they cared about your liver, but because a tipsy man before noon was a danger to everything. Livestock, sermons, marriages. The afternoon drinker might only stumble and shout. But the morning drunkard was capable of crime confession or collapsing into the town well. So the taverns learned to adjust. Some placed salt in their mugs, a test for guests. If you couldn't taste it, you were too far gone. Others used coloured twine on cup handles to indicate strength. Red for potent blue, for mild, and black for the stuff that caused dreams about drowning in beer while being lectured by your childhood teacher. Still, mistakes happened. You could walk in expecting a quiet evening order, a light ale, and be handed something that made your fingers tingle. It was all part of the charm or the curse, depending on your perspective. You see, the danger of medieval drinking wasn't always loud or immediate. Sometimes it whispered, a slow unravelling of reason, a gentle tug at your sense of self, a cup shared too freely, a recipe too ambitious, a bartender too eager to experiment, and the next thing you knew you were outside clutching a chicken you didn't remember buying, singing a ballad in a language you didn't speak with your trousers on backwards and a tooth in your pocket. And that was on a good night. The tavern did not forgive easily. Its floors remembered every spill, its benches creaked in warning. But the mugs, those vessels of camaraderie and chaos they held, all the secrets, lip prints layered like tree rings, stories embedded in every scratch, ghosts maybe, germs definitely. You drained your cup and reached for another. By the time your fourth drink had settled in your stomach like a loaf of burning bread, something curious began to happen. The edges of the world started to wobble, not fall apart exactly, but loosen. Conversation no longer felt like a sequence of words, but a wave of warm noise that rose and fell like the sea. You stopped noticing the cold draughts from under the door. You stopped noticing how sticky the bench was beneath you. And dangerously, you started to feel bold. This was when the games began. You didn't come to the tavern to play games. Not really, but they were always there, bubbling up between sips born of boredom, bravado and booze. Some were simple wagers, a coin toss, a guessing game, or a contest to see who could drink the fastest. But as the night deepened, the games got stranger, riskier. Less about winning and more about surviving. The first game you witnessed that evening was a classic knife. Between the fingers, a man with scarred hands and a voice like gravel lined up his fingers on the table and began jabbing a short dagger between them in a blur of motion. A small crowd gathered. They cheered with each successful stab and groaned when the knife caught the wood just a hair too close to skin. His left hand never flinched. His right hand held the blade like it was an extension of his thoughts. Coins clinked into a bowl beside him, not payment bets. Someone nudged you and asked if you'd like to try. You declined politely. Then again more firmly they nodded. Respectable, they said. Cowardly, they meant. But that was fine. You still had your fingers. You intended to keep them. Nearby another table had a dice game in progress. 6 players sat in a crooked circle around a leather mat covered in ash and chalk symbols. Each rolled 2 bone dice in turn and either shouted in triumph or cursed loudly in a dialect you didn't recognise. The stakes weren't just coins. One man had bet his boots. Another wagered his wife's comb, which he swore was ivory. A woman with a sharp smile placed a small pouch on the mat that jingled oddly. No one asked what was inside. Everyone seemed slightly afraid to know. Dice in medieval taverns weren't always honest. Weighted bones were common, so were secret hand signals between accomplices. It wasn't unheard of for a fight to break out when the same lucky number showed up for the 4th time in a row. But calling someone a cheat was serious business. You had to be sure. And even then you had to be ready. Because the moment you spoke the word, the mood changed. Friends became foes, chairs became weapons. And the tavern keeper's eyes locked on you like a hawk sizing up a wounded rabbit. But not all games were so formal. Some emerged organically from the ether of drunken minds, like who can hold their ale, which was not a metaphor. Participants took turns holding full mugs of ale at arm's length, straight out in front of them for as long as they could. No spilling, no bending, just trembling arms and clenched teeth. The prize, pride. And sometimes the right to mock the loser for the rest of the night. Then there was last word a shouting match where each participant tried to end every story with a bigger, louder, more unbelievable conclusion than the last. It began with someone claiming they had outrun a bear. It escalated to another swearing he had punched a ghost. Eventually someone insisted he once drank a barrel of mead in one sitting, only to discover afterward that it had been fermenting with a dead squirrel inside. Whether or not it was true didn't matter. What mattered was who the room believed, and that usually came down to who could shout the longest without vomiting. Of course, gambling wasn't limited to games. It bled into everything. You could wager on anything in a tavern. Who would fall asleep first? Who would fall over next? Whether the bard would finish the next song without breaking a string or forgetting the lyrics. The room loved a good bet. The house took no cut, and if you lost, you paid quickly. If you didn't, the tavern would make you pay in other ways. Washing dishes was one. Scrubbing floors with a sheep's skull was another. Sitting outside in the cold with no coat for an hour was not unheard of. Some taverns had a list of punishments scrawled behind the bar. Others made it up on the spot. Some nights a new game would be invented on the fly. That's what happened just past midnight when someone spilled a jug of cider and began sliding tankards across the floor like curling stones. It became a sport. Distance and accuracy were judged. The dog became an unwilling obstacle. Cheers echoed with every successful slide that ended with a thud against the far wall. When the tavern keeper noticed the scuff marks on the floor, she ended the fun with a ladle to someone's ear. The room moved on. There was also the game of storytelling itself. Everyone wanted to be heard. Everyone had a tale. A knight who claimed to have slain a dragon. A farmer who swore he had dug up a Roman coin shaped like a chicken. A widow who insisted her dead husband haunted her bed only when it was raining. You learned to listen for patterns. The same story might surface twice in one night, told by two different people, each insisting it was their own. No one called them out. In the tavern, ownership of truth was negotiable. The bard played a role in the games as well. He watched. He listened. And when a story amused him enough, he turned it into a song that was the real prize immortality in rhyme. Even if the story was twisted beyond recognition, even if your name was changed to something that rhymed better with slop or sock, it meant you had made an impact. People would hum your tale long after you'd left, maybe long after you'd sobered up. But with every game, with every bet, with every boast, the danger grew. Not from the games themselves, but from what they stirred. Pride, envy, drunken ambition. One wrong word, one misunderstood gesture, and the night could turn. A friendly wager became an accusation. A failed throw turned into a shove, a spilled drink, an insult, a joke that landed too close to the bone. These were the sparks. And when the sparks hit dry kindling, the room erupted. But not yet. Not tonight. At least not now. You watched the games unfold, your mug resting gently in your hands, warm from the fire and sticky from the bottom. You laughed with the winners, you nodded solemnly at the losers. You shook your head at the man who tried to juggle 3 boiled eggs and ended up covered in yolk. And in the middle of it all you felt something strange. A lightness. Not joy exactly, but connection. For a moment, despite the stink and the noise and the lurking threat of violence, you belonged. You weren't just watching the game. You were part of it. And somewhere in the back of your mind you knew that was the real danger. You drank. And the games went on. The 5th drink was always the dangerous one. The first made you brave, the second made you talkative, the third made you clumsy, and the 4th made you think you were still in control. But the fifth knocked on the inside of your skull, slipped something mischievous into your bloodstream and began whispering very bad ideas in your ear. In the medieval tavern, the 5th drink had a reputation. Not a specific name, but a mood, a phase. It was when voices started to rise, eyes lingered too long, and everything from spilled ale to accidental elbow bumps became a matter of personal offence. You might still be smiling, but your jaw was tight. You might still be laughing, but your hand had curled into a fist. No one ever said I've had 5. They didn't have to. The room knew. You could feel it in the shift of the crowd, the subtle stiffening of backs, the glances tossed like dice across flickering firelight. The mead was partly to blame. It was the drink of choice for those who wanted something sweet but strong. The medieval version of wrapping a wolf in a sheepskin and asking it to sing you to sleep. Good mead went down like honey water and hit like a thrown brick. Bad mead tasted like vinegar laced with flowers and did much the same. The danger wasn't just in the strength, it was in the speed. By the time you realised how much you'd had, your legs had already begun to disagree with gravity. But the real problem wasn't the drink, it was the way it magnified everything inside you. The 5th round didn't invent your anger, your sadness, or your fear. It simply unscrewed the lid and let it all come boiling out. And in a room full of people drinking their 5ths together, the result was volatile. Take, for example, the man by the fire who'd spent the first hour of the evening laughing too loudly at every joke and toasting anyone who made eye contact. By drink number 5, he was weeping into his sleeve, convinced his horse was a reincarnated monk who judged him every morning. Or the woman near the door who had won 3 hands of dice and spent her winnings on another round for the table. Now she stood on that very table holding a ladle like a sceptre, demanding someone duel her for the title of Ale Queen. The crowd loved it. They always did. The tavern thrived on performance, but performance edged easily into provocation. A misplaced cheer, a sarcastic clap, and suddenly someone was being helped off the floor with a bloody nose and a wobbling smile. And then there were the quiet ones, the real danger. The men and women who said nothing for the first few rounds, who sipped slowly, eyes, steady ears open by drink 5. They were still quiet, but now their stillness was heavier, intentional. The kind of quiet that filled cracks in the conversation, that changed the energy of a table without making a sound. These were the drinkers who'd seen fights start, who'd ended a few themselves. You didn't bother them, you didn't joke with them. You certainly didn't bump into them. If they raised a mug to you, you raised one back, and if they lowered their gaze, you looked elsewhere. Taverns had no rules, but they had a language. A flick of the eyes, a raised eyebrow, a tap on the bench, signals built from experience, instinct, and shared understanding. And when drink 5 hit the room like a slow-moving thunderstorm, the language changed. It became sharper, shorter, less forgiving. That's when the furniture started shifting. Not moved necessarily, but adjusted. People widened their stance, backs toward walls, turned so they could see the whole room. The old-timers moved their mugs closer, their knives closer still. The tavern keeper, who had spent the evening pretending not to hear anything, suddenly stood a little straighter behind the bar. She didn't reach for the club beneath the counter. Not yet, but her eyes had narrowed. The bard noticed too, his song slowed. He picked a different tune. Something softer. A lullaby, maybe. It wasn't about calming the room. It was about lowering the temperature, distracting just enough to give the mead-addled minds another thread to follow. But he was also smart enough to shift his position toward the back corner. Safer there. And then it happened. It always happened. This time it began with a joke. A harmless thing. Something about a miller's daughter and a clumsy bishop. The joke wasn't even funny, but it ended with the wrong word spoken to the wrong man. A man who had just finished his 5th drink and discovered perhaps for the first time that he'd never really liked laughter to begin with. He stood too fast, his stool scraped back and toppled over. His cloak flared. He slapped the table and the room held its breath. Now a smart man would have apologised, laughed it off, bought another round, but smart men rarely made it to their 5th drink in one piece. Instead, this man pointed, accused, shouted, challenged. The accused stood slowly brushing crumbs from his tunic. He was younger, leaner, and not nearly drunk enough. That was its own danger. An insulted man with clear eyes and fast reflexes could be a real problem, but pride had already taken the reins. Neither would back down. The crowd formed a loose circle. Not out of curiosity, out of habit. This was as much part of the evening as music and stew. A scuffle, a burst of chaos, a brief storm to shake the walls. They circled, they squared up. Someone whispered odds. Someone else placed a coin. The first punch missed. The second didn't. Tankards tipped, chairs screeched. The dog under the table barked once and then wisely disappeared behind a barrel. A fist met a chin, a knee met a stomach. The room burst into cheers. It was short-lived. Most tavern fights were, not because anyone broke them up quickly, but because the participants burned out fast. 5 drinks didn't leave much energy for prolonged conflict. The first swing was fire, the second was smoke. The third was usually a wheeze, followed by someone collapsing onto the floor, groaning dramatically and claiming they'd been stabbed even if no blade was in sight. The fight ended with both men on the ground, one cradling his hand, the other cradling his pride. No blood, no serious harm, just the smell of sweat and spilled ale. The tavern keeper waited until they were done, then she stepped forward, grabbed each by the collar and dragged them to the door. Not thrown out, just relocated like garbage on collection day. The room returned to its rhythm, the bard picked up the tempo, the dice clattered again, and the rest of the patrons lifted their mugs in a silent toast to surviving another 5th drink. You took a breath. Your mug was still in your hand, still half full or half empty. Depending on whether you were planning a toast or an apology, you raised it, touched it to your lips, and drank again, because after 5, there was always 6 around the 6th drink. Hunger often arrived like a knight in dented armour. Bold, clumsy and poorly timed, your stomach, which had up until this point been content to soak in a slurry of bitter ales and bad decisions, suddenly remembered its true purpose. It growled, it twisted, it made promises your brain couldn't ignore, and so inevitably you found yourself leaning back on your bench, raising a crooked finger and calling for food. The tavern keeper, who had already spent the last hour ignoring loud patrons and pretending not to see the man passed out in the fireplace, gave a small grunt in response. She didn't ask what you wanted. There was no menu, there were no options, there was only stew. Every medieval tavern had stew, not as a specialty but as a necessity. It simmered endlessly in a blackened cauldron hung above the hearth, bubbling gently like a spell. No one could quite say what was in it. Some said it was meat. Others said it was roots, and one man swore he once bit into something that looked suspiciously like a button. The truth was, the stew was everything, a culinary catch-all. Whatever hadn't rotted, escaped or been stolen made its way into the pot. You didn't eat the stew, you braved it. It arrived in a chipped wooden bowl sloshed half over the rim and accompanied by a spoon that had seen too many winters. The colour was best described as uncertain. Not quite brown, not quite grey, a colour born from compromise. Steam rose from its surface, carrying notes of onion, cabbage, and possibly despair. A crust of bread as tough as a cobblestone was dropped on the side like a challenge. But you were too far in to back out now. Your 6th drink had loosened your pride and your stomach had made its case, so you took your first spoonful. It wasn't awful. Not quite. It was hot. It was vaguely meaty. It didn't fight back. You chewed with caution. There was something chewy, something stringy, and something that might once have been a carrot or a beet, or a particularly adventurous mushroom you didn't ask. Around you, others were eating too. Some used spoons, some used fingers. One man simply lifted the bowl to his mouth and drank it like ale, which resulted in a burnt tongue and a splash down his front. No one helped. No one laughed. This was stew time, sacred and slightly dangerous. There were stories, of course, tales of what had been found in tavern stews. A wedding ring, a rat's tail, a toenail, although that might have been from the spoon. One traveller swore he found a boiled feather, and another claimed to have bitten into a pearl. But still people ate. Because stew filled the gaps between drinks because it soaked up the ale. Because it was warm and predictable and didn't talk back. And yet, despite its comfort, the stew had a power of its own. It changed the room. It slowed the pace, brought quiet. For a few minutes the tavern softened. Arguments paused. Songs faded. Dice games halted mid-roll. Everyone focused on chewing on, swallowing on, not burning their tongues. This was the eye of the storm. The stew settled your stomach, but it didn't erase the drink, it simply buried it, gave it something to wrestle with, and while your belly quieted, your mind wandered. You found yourself staring into the bowl, watching the way the light danced on the surface. A small bubble rose and popped, sending a ripple through the greasy broth. Somewhere deep inside, you imagined a whole world of forgotten ingredients swirling and sinking, fusing into a flavour that could never be replicated and probably shouldn't be. It was then you heard the story. A man 2 benches down had begun to speak, slowly, quietly. Not to anyone in particular, but the room hushed around him. He told of a tavern far to the north where the stew had been cooking for 30 years, never emptied, never washed, just topped up, layer upon layer of history boiled into oblivion. He claimed each bite held a piece of someone's past, a forgotten love, a lost war, a bad debt. He claimed the locals believed the stew could speak, that if you listened closely you could hear it whisper. The room was silent. Then the bard hiccuped. The spell broke. Laughter returned, dice clattered. The spoon clinked against your bowl and you remembered where you were. Still the story lingered. You looked again at your stew, wondered how long it had been cooking, wondered how many hands had stirred it, wondered whether the broth contained memories of other nights like this one. You took another bite. It tasted the same, but now with a pinch of mystery. Somewhere, someone burped. The dog under the table snored. The man in the corner who hadn't spoken all night suddenly asked for seconds. And just like that, the tavern moved on. Your bowl emptied. Your spoon scraped the bottom. You wiped your mouth with your sleeve and tossed the bread to the dog. He sniffed it, sneezed, and lay back down. The fire crackled. A fresh round of drinks appeared. You'd barely noticed the server. She moved like fog, quick and quiet and impossible to follow. Your mug refilled. Your 6th drink was now a memory replaced by number 7. And yet the stew stayed with you. Not as flavour, but as feeling. A weight. A warmth. A reminder that even in a place filled with noise and madness, something could still slow you down, even if only for a moment. You raised your mug, toasted no one in particular, and drank again. By the time the 7th drink arrived, you had begun to lose track of your own name. Not entirely not enough to cause alarm, but enough that if someone asked you to repeat it twice, you'd need a few seconds and possibly a glance at your boots for inspiration. This was not unusual. The 7th drink was the point in the evening where identity started to peel away like old bark from a wet log. You were no longer a traveller or a blacksmith or a disgraced monk. You were simply part of the tavern, a moving limb in a drunken body, a face in a foggy mirror. It was at this vulnerable moment when your purse hung loose, your judgment floated gently above your head, and your eyes refused to focus on anything smaller than a loaf of bread that the real danger arrived. Not with a shout, not with a brawl, but with silence, with stillness, with sleight of hand. Because every medieval tavern had its thieves. They didn't wear masks, they didn't sneak in through windows, they were already here. They'd been here since before the stew started to bubble. You might have passed one on the way in. You might have nodded to one earlier in the evening, you might even be sitting next to one right now. Tavern thieves were not the dramatic sort. They didn't pick locks or hold daggers to throats. Their weapons were patience, proximity, and the quiet confidence that no one would remember them clearly the next morning. They didn't need to run, they simply needed to blend, and in a place where most guests couldn't recall where they left their cloak, that wasn't hard to do. It often began with a bump, a friendly clap on the shoulder, a toast, a shared joke. You laughed, you turned, and in that second your coin pouch was lighter. Not gone, not yet, but certainly lighter. The thief didn't take everything, that would be suspicious. They took just enough, a few coins a token, something you wouldn't notice until the sun rose and your headache screamed louder than your curiosity. Other times the thieves worked in pairs. One would distract, the other would disappear under the table. You might feel a tug at your boot, a shift in the bench. You might chalk it up to the dog or your imagination. But by the time you checked, the flap of your satchel was ajar and your prize from the market, a bone-handled comb or a piece of carved wood, was gone. Children were especially skilled. Not your children, of course. Never your children, but someone else's. Sharp-eyed, quiet-footed, and trained by mothers who smiled sweetly as they served your drinks. A child would appear beside you, offer to fetch more bread, and vanish just as quickly, leaving you one spoon but no knife. You wouldn't even think to blame them. Not until your boots felt looser and your belt hung differently. There were stories, of course, tales of the legendary thieves of taverns past. One man was said to have relieved 3 knights of their coin a ring, and one very expensive belt buckle, all while carrying a tray of stew. Another was rumoured to have replaced an entire purse with a pouch of pebbles so perfectly balanced that the owner didn't notice until he tried to buy a pig the next day. The best thieves were never noticed. They weren't loud, they weren't flashy, they didn't swagger. They watched, they waited, They memorised patterns, who drank quickly, who laughed loudly, who kept checking their pouch like it was a nervous tick. They picked their marks the way bards pick songs with care and timing, and once they struck they melted back into the crowd, mug in hand, grin on face, perhaps even offering to help search for what was lost. But it wasn't just coin they took. Some were listeners, traders in secrets. A drunken boast could be worth more than gold, a whispered name, a tale of treasure, a confession not meant for public ears. These things had value, and in the right company they could be sold or traded. Sometimes a thief's goal wasn't to empty your pockets, but to fill their own with knowledge. To them, your slurred stories were coins of a different kind. You learned to guard yourself in strange ways. You tied your pouch with double knots, you wedged it under your thigh. You kept your knife visible, you never let your drink out of sight. You sat against the wall if you could. You checked the floor before you stood up. But even then it wasn't always enough. Because the tavern was alive, it moved and shifted like a slow beast, and the thieves moved with it, not against it. They didn't disturb the current, they swam through it. By the time you looked back, they were somewhere else, sipping quietly, laughing with someone new, patting the dog as if they hadn't just taken half a dozen brass tokens and the clasp from your cloak. And here's the part no one liked to admit. Sometimes you let them, not consciously of course, but part of you knew that the tavern had its toll, that the seventh drink came with a price, that to sit in that warmth, in that noise, in that chaos, you had to give something up. Maybe it was a coin, maybe it was a keepsake, maybe it was just a story you hadn't meant to tell. You didn't speak of it later, when the sun rose and your boots were lighter and your pouch rattled with fewer coins. You didn't go back and accuse anyone. You didn't storm in demanding justice. Because the tavern didn't promise safety, it promised company. It promised firelight and noise and a place to forget the cold, and for that you paid. You took another sip. The seventh drink burned but softer now. Your vision blurred at the edges. You reached for your pouch and felt less. You smiled. Of course. The tavern had taken its share. And the night wasn't over. At some point in the medieval tavern, the night stopped being about drinking and started being about surviving until morning. It crept up on you quietly like a frost. One moment you were laughing too hard at a joke, no one could remember the next. You were blinking slowly, mouth half open, trying to remember what your last sentence was supposed to be. The seventh or eighth drink had melted the hours into something thick and slow. The bard's song had looped around again this time with new lyrics that made less sense than before. The stew was long gone. The mead had turned warm in your cup. Your body leaned against the table, your neck bent at an uncomfortable angle that somehow felt like a pillow. And then it hit you. You weren't going home. Maybe home was too far. Maybe home was just a blanket over a pile of hay in a rented corner of someone's barn. Or maybe you didn't really have one anymore, not one worth walking back to in the dark. Whatever the reason, you knew it, deep in your bones you were sleeping here. Sleeping in a medieval tavern wasn't unusual. It wasn't dignified or warm or safe, but it was expected. The tavern itself was built around the assumption that some of its patrons wouldn't make it out before sunrise. Some were too drunk, some were too tired, some were too broke. Others simply didn't want to walk past the town gallows in the dark. There were no rooms for rent. Not unless you were very rich or the tavern happened to have a dusty loft with enough straw to pretend it was bedding. For everyone else, sleep happened where it could. Some curled up by the hearth, not too close or you'd wake up hairless on one side of your face. Others took their bench with them, laying back with arms folded, and one boot still on the universal sign for "I am not passed out, I am merely resting." A few slid gently under the table, sharing floor space with dogs, discarded bones and other sleeping bodies. And then there were the corners, dark, cold, quiet. Those who slept there did so with their back against the wall, hand on their pouch and eyes half open. These were the ones who knew better, who had slept in too many taverns in too many towns, and had learned the hard way that midnight made promises sunrise never kept. Because the tavern didn't stop, not really. The fire burned low, but never out. The bard stopped singing, but someone always muttered something. There were coughs, snores, shuffles. The clink of a mug set down too hard. The occasional moan of someone having a very bad dream or a very bad stomach. And through it all, the tavern keeper moved, cleaning, wiping, watching. She didn't mind people sleeping on her floor as long as they didn't vomit in the stew or bleed on the firewood. She'd seen it all, lovers curled together like cats, fighters snoring side by side. One man once slept, hugging a barrel and refused to let go even when morning came. But sleeping in a tavern wasn't really about rest. It was about waiting. Waiting for the headache to hit. Waiting for the nausea to pass. Waiting for the light to return through cracked shutters so you could pretend to be respectable again. It was about listening too. The things you heard while half asleep on a tavern bench could haunt you. Whispers in the dark, arguments that started soft and ended in silence. The sound of someone leaving quietly, too quietly through the back door, a blade being unsheathed and then put away. The creak of a floorboard that never creaked before. Some people claimed that taverns were haunted, that spirits lingered in the rafters drawn by spilled blood and unspoken regrets, that you could feel them if you stayed perfectly still, your breath shallow, your eyes barely open. They moved between sleepers looking for something or someone, or maybe they were just waiting like you. Whether or not you believed in ghosts, you believed in rats. They were very real. You'd hear them under the floor in the walls, occasionally scuttling across someone's sleeping chest. No one screamed, that was the rule. You could shiver, you could mutter a curse, but you didn't scream, not unless the rat bit you, and even then you'd best check who you woke before doing anything dramatic. Sometimes someone woke up confused. They forgot where they were. They sat up too fast, looked around and shouted a name that didn't belong to anyone in the room. The tavern keeper would shush them. Someone else would throw a boot, and the rest of the room would roll over and forget it. Ever happened. Some woke up crying, quietly, others laughing, and some didn't wake at all. Not that they died necessarily. They just chose not to face morning yet, wrapped in cloaks pressed against walls, hiding from whatever daylight might bring. You on your end tried to sleep. You lay on your side, hand under your head, one boot still on because that made it easier to leave quickly if needed. Your pouch was tucked into your shirt, your knife close by. You closed your eyes. But the tavern didn't let go so easily. It breathed around you. The fire snapped. The bench groaned. Someone muttered in their sleep. Someone else giggled. You heard the wind outside and remembered the road you weren't walking tonight. You heard the creak of the tavern keeper's steps and felt oddly safer. You drifted. Dreams came thick and strange, half memories, half invention. You dreamed of falling into the stew, of drinking something that whispered secrets, of a bard with no face who sang a lullaby, in a language you somehow knew. You dreamed of your own hands reaching for something you'd lost long ago. When you woke, it was still dark, or maybe it was early. The tavern looked different, emptier, the fire a dull red. Some of the bodies had moved, some hadn't. A rooster crowed outside, somewhere a church bell rang. You stretched, your back ached. Your mouth tasted like old spoons, but your pouch was still on you. Your boots miraculously still matched. You had survived the night, barely rested but alive. You sat up, rubbed your face, and waited for the next mug. Because nothing woke you up like the first drink of the new day, there is no quiet quite like the quiet of a medieval tavern in the early morning. It doesn't come all at once. It creeps in careful not to disturb the last snores still echoing under tables, or the slow hiss of dying embers in the hearth. The air changes first. The warmth of bodies has faded. The smell of stew, smoke, and stale drink lingers, but no longer overpowers. Cold has crept back in, slipping through the gaps in the door, and the cracks in the floor, curling its fingers around the ankles of every sleeper, still bold or foolish enough to lie on the planks. You open your eyes, at least you think you do. It takes a moment to be sure. Your vision feels gummy, like your eyelids have grown thicker in the night. Your mouth is dry. Your tongue tastes like you licked the side of an old boot. Your head is heavy but not painful. Not yet. The ache is coming. You can feel it waiting politely at the edge of your awareness, stretching and yawning like it's just waking up too. You sit up slowly. Very slowly. Your spine makes a sound like someone stepping on a frozen twig. Your neck crackles, your back protests, but you are upright. That's the first victory of the day. The tavern around you is a battlefield. Bodies are sprawled in every direction. Some are covered in cloaks. Some use their own arms as pillows. One man has a bench leg under his ribs and doesn't seem to mind. A dog is curled up in the hearth, snoring softly, one paw twitching as if chasing something in its dreams. The fire is mostly ash now. A few red coals glow stubbornly surrounded by a ring of empty mugs and half-eaten crusts. The smell hits you next. Not a new smell, not entirely bad, just honest. It's the smell of sweat, smoke, old onions, spilled ale, wet wool, and the deep earthy stink of a room that held too many people for too many hours. It smells like history, like regret, like everything you don't want to remember but know you eventually will. Your pouch is still on you. You check that first, it's instinct, not paranoia, and miraculously there's still something inside. A few coins, a button, a folded scrap of paper with something scribbled on it in your own handwriting that reads, "Don't trust the baker, you have no memory of writing it." Your boots are mismatched, but they're both yours. You wriggle your toes and decide you can walk, that's enough for now. Around you others begin to stir, not all at once. A cough here, a groan there. Someone sits up too fast and immediately regrets it. Clutching their stomach and swearing softly, the bard is curled in the corner with his lute across his chest like a shield. One of the strings has snapped, he hasn't noticed yet. The tavern keeper is already awake, of course she is. You get the sense she never truly sleeps. She moves through the wreckage with the efficiency of someone who's cleaned up after more nights like this than she can count. A bucket, a rag, a broom that might also be a weapon. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. The sound of her boots against the floorboards is enough to make a few people pretend to be asleep a little longer. There's a ritual to mornings like this, a strange, silent choreography. You rise, you stretch, you find a mug with just enough in the bottom to swish around your mouth and spit into the fire. You scrape together the last of the breadcrumbs from your sleeve and chew them like they're a feast. You nod to the man next to you even though you can't remember his name, and he nods back with the same glassy-eyed reverence. You survived the same storm that makes you brothers for at least another hour. Eventually the stew returns, or a version of it, a fresh pot thinner, saltier, designed less for taste and more for stability. You accept a bowl with shaking hands. It scalds your mouth, but you don't complain. You need it. You need something hot and real and boring to anchor you to the morning. The bard wakes up. He hums a few bars, finds them acceptable, and begins a quiet melody. It's a lullaby, soft, wordless, not meant for sleep now, but for healing. The tavern sighs in response. The stories begin again, slowly. Someone asks what happened to the man who challenged the bread seller to a duel. Someone else insists they saw a ghost in the fireplace. Another swears he won every game of dice last night. Even though no one remembers seeing him play, truth is optional. Consistency is irrelevant. Morning stories in a tavern are about claiming something. Anything to carry with you into the daylight. And then comes the reckoning. Coins are counted, debts are argued. One man tries to pay with a carving of a fish, insisting it's worth more than silver. The tavern keeper disagrees. She takes his belt instead. No one intervenes. You gather your things, slowly, carefully. You check the floor around you just in case you left a piece of your dignity there. You find only a spoon. You put it in your pocket. It might come in handy. Outside, the world is cold, bright, unwelcoming, but real. The road waits. The sky is the colour of dishwater. Somewhere church bells are ringing. Somewhere people are already working. You are not one of them. Not yet. You take one last look inside. The tavern is still full of movement, cleaning, eating, laughing, arguing. It doesn't sleep. It simply resets. You nod to the tavern keeper. She doesn't nod back. She never does, but you think she sees you. You step outside. The door closes behind you. The headache arrives right on cue. But still you survived. The night took something from you. It always does. But it gave you something too. A story, a bruise, a new favourite place to avoid for at least a week. You breathe. You walk. And somewhere behind you the tavern door creaks open again for the next fool brave enough to step through. By the time you return to the tavern, on another bitter evening, there was no doubt who truly ran the place. It wasn't the bard, though he made enough noise for 3 men. It wasn't the burly man at the back table who could crush a walnut with his thumb. And it certainly wasn't the brewer whose questionable concoctions had the consistency of soup and the potency of sin. No, it was the alewife. She was never announced. She did not strut or boast or raise her voice more than necessary, but everyone knew. The room shifted when she entered. The noise softened. The elbows came off the table. People moved without being told to. In a world where men swung swords and shouted for attention, she commanded with silence and side eyes sharper than any blade. You first noticed her by the way others behaved around her, the way the dice games paused when she passed, the way the drunkest man in the room remembered his manners long enough to pull his feet off the table, the way the regulars lowered their voices when they mentioned her name as if the wooden beams of the tavern might snitch. She was older but not weak. Her arms were strong from years of lifting barrels and dragging fools. Her voice was worn but firm. Her eyes saw everything. Everything who came in together, who left separately, who argued quietly in corners, who hid bruises under sleeves. She noticed the purse that sagged less by the end of the night, the child who returned more often than a mother could afford, the guest who drank like he was trying to forget the calendar. The alewife didn't forget anything. She poured drinks with a precision that could be called cruel, just enough to dull the pain, never enough to drown it. If you were lucky, she liked you. If you were unlucky, she simply tolerated you, and if she didn't like you well, you'd know. Your stew would arrive cold. Your seat would always be next to the draught. And one day, without warning, you'd find yourself politely but permanently unwelcome. She ran the books, she ran the cellar. She knew which mugs leaked and which ones weren't to be trusted. She knew which barrels were nearing vinegar and which ones were best saved for nobles who thought they could taste the difference. She could do the tavern's accounts in her head while serving 3 drinks and refereeing an argument over who had stolen whose pig back in the spring. But she wasn't just a keeper of the till. She was a keeper of stories. She heard them all. The confessions, the lies, the drunk brags, and the whispered regrets. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. People told her things, because the tavern was the only place they had left to say them, because after enough drinks and enough silence, a man will say anything to the one who refills his cup. She never interrupted, never judged. She listened and filed it all away. They said she had once been a noblewoman, or a widow, or a witch. Some claimed she had taken over the tavern after killing her husband with a ladle. Others whispered that she'd simply arrived one day and started cleaning, and no one dared ask her to stop. Whatever the truth was, no one knew for sure, and no one was foolish enough to press her. There was one thing everyone agreed on, though she kept the peace. It wasn't the guards, it wasn't the law, it was her. If 2 men began circling each other, breathing fire and bile, one glare from her could freeze them mid-step. If someone raised a mug with too much force or a voice with too much venom, she'd slam her hand on the bar and the sound alone would silence the room. If you caused trouble twice, she'd give you a warning. If you caused it 3 times, she'd give you a scar. There were stories about the time she flung a man out the door by his belt with one hand, or the night she broke up a brawl by pouring a bucket of cold stew on both fighters and saying, "You want to act like pigs? I'll feed you like pigs." The crowd had laughed, the fighters had left, and neither had returned. Still, she had a kind side, or at least a fair one. If someone came in out of the cold, ragged and wet, she'd find them a corner near the hearth. If someone lost more than just coin a job, a child, a reason, she'd quietly place a bowl in front of them, without asking for payment, but if they took advantage, they never got a second chance. She had no patience for thieves, but she respected cleverness. If you tried to cheat her and failed, you were banned. If you tried to cheat her and succeeded, she might offer you a job, sweeping floors or watching the door. Either way, she always knew. Some said she kept a list. Not written down, just remembered. Who owed what, who had lied, who had cried, who had kissed someone they shouldn't have, and who had walked home alone even when they didn't want to. And yet, despite her authority, she wasn't feared, not exactly. She was respected, because she never lost control. Not when the ale ran low, not when the bard passed out mid-song, not when the fire nearly caught the rafters, not even when the taxmen came and demanded a higher cut. She met them with the same look she gave everyone else, that flat-measured stare that said, "I know more than you, try me." She wasn't warm, she wasn't cold, she was constant. And in a world that shifted with every sunrise that meant something. You watched her one night as she cleaned the bar after everyone else had fallen asleep. The fire was low, the snoring had begun, the last drunk had finally stopped mumbling into his empty mug, and there she was wiping a clean spot that didn't need wiping, staring at the door as if waiting for someone she already knew would arrive. You almost asked her a question, but then you didn't. Because some answers aren't meant to be given. and some people like the alewife aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be remembered. Fights in a medieval tavern were not rare events. They were almost part of the architecture woven into the wood of the benches and stained into the very stones of the hearth. If you walked into a tavern and didn't hear a story about a broken table or a tooth left behind on the floorboards, it meant you had either arrived before supper or after the place had just been rebuilt. There was always something that sparked it, though. The reasons often evaporated by morning. It could begin with spilled ale or a poorly timed joke or a glance held 1 second too long. Sometimes it was a song sung in the wrong dialect, or someone bragging about winning too many games of dice in a row, but more often than not it was the drink itself that did the talking. The first mug made you warm, the second made you generous, the third made you brave, and the fourth made you stupid. Somewhere between stupid and brave is where most brawls were born. They didn't start with a punch. They started with a pause, a shift in the air, a stillness between two men who had just been laughing a moment ago, a chair leg scraping slightly too far back, a mug being set down just a little too hard, and then someone said something they shouldn't have, and that was it. One man stood, the other man stood, and suddenly the whole tavern was watching without watching. No one wanted a fight, but no one really minded either. It was something to do before the stew was ready. The brawls were fast, clumsy, loud. There was no skill to them. Not usually, just fists and fury, boots and elbows. Sometimes a chair joined in or a spoon. One man once tried to use a sausage as a weapon. It did not end well for the sausage and the tables. Oh, the poor tables. No matter where the fight started, it ended on top of at least one table, usually with a crash and a spray of mugs and meat. The tavern keeper never intervened. Not unless blood hit the bar or someone fell into the fire, she'd let it run its course, arms folded, expression flat as if watching two chickens fight in the yard. When it ended, as it always did, with someone on the floor groaning and someone else yelling about his back, she'd simply sigh, grab a rag and start wiping down the damage. It wasn't personal, not usually. A few minutes later, the same two men might be sharing a drink again, black eyes and all. There was a strange honour to it, like the fight had cleared the air, but not always. Sometimes grudges formed slow and sticky like spilled honey, and then things got dangerous because some men didn't forget, and a bottle to the head hurt far less than a blade slipped under the cloak a week later. That's when the alewife stepped in. She knew the difference. She could feel it. When a brawl was just drunken chaos, she let it be. But when it was something darker, she moved fast. A hand on a shoulder, a whispered warning, or in extreme cases a boot to the ribs. She didn't need help. She was the help. The regulars learned where not to stand. Near the fireplace was risky unless you enjoyed dodging bodies. The far corner offered a good view, but was often the site of second-round grudges. And under the table was only safe until someone fell on top of you. You learned with time to spot the warning signs, the eyes narrowing, the shift in tone, the clenching jaw. You knew when to get your mug out of the way, and when to pretend to be very interested in the grain of the table. Some taverns posted rules: no weapons, no fighting, no shouting, but they were rarely enforced. Rules in a medieval tavern were more like suggestions printed on smoke and spilled wine. The real law was momentum. Once a fight began, it was a beast fed by cheers and curses growing bigger until it ran out of breath. You never knew what would happen next. One fight ended with a marriage proposal, another with someone winning a goat in a bet they didn't remember making. One night the fight spilled into the street, and by the time the guards arrived it had turned into a dance. No one knew how, but there they were, bloodied and bruised and twirling like children. That was the thing about tavern brawls. They were never just violence. They were theatre, a release. A reminder that under all the ale and laughter, people were still animals wrapped in wool and wanting to be seen. And in the end, when the bruises faded and the teeth stopped wobbling, you had a story. Something to hold on to. Something to tell the next time someone raised a mug a little too high and looked at you a little too long. You'd tap your swollen nose smile with one less tooth and say, "Careful, now I remember what happened last time." And the tavern would laugh, and the fire would crackle, and the mugs would clink, and for a moment, just a moment, everything would be calm, until the next brawl. Not every danger in a medieval tavern came from fists or fire or foul-smelling brews. Some came softly strumming a lute, humming off-key and reciting poetry that sounded like it had been written in the back of a cart while drunk and upside down. Yes, we must now speak of the bard. The bard, that eternal creature of song and ego, roamed from tavern to tavern like a moth, to flame drawn not by the warmth or the light, but by the promise of coin attention, and perhaps a place to sleep indoors. You'd hear him before you saw him. A creaky note, a misplaced chord. Then the voice lilting and theatrical, announcing his presence as if he had just been summoned from the heavens by a choir of angels. But there were no angels in the tavern, just a crowd half soaked in ale and entirely out of patience. The bard was both entertainment and risk. On a good night he could silence the room, his fingers dancing across the strings like water, his voice lifting above the firelight with tales of faraway kings and star-crossed lovers. On a good night people leaned in, forgot their aches, and maybe tossed him a coin or two. But on a bad night he sang about the wrong lord, or fumbled the lyrics to a local ballad, or hit a note so foul it made the cat hiss and leave the hearth. On a bad night someone might throw a mug, or worse a boot. Bards had to be clever. Their wit had to be sharp enough to dodge insults, and their instincts honed enough to know when to switch songs mid-verse to keep from getting tackled by a disgruntled cousin of the night they just mocked in rhyme. Many carried more than just a loot, a knife in the boot, a flask in the cloak, a secret way out of every town they performed in. This one, though this tavern's bard, he was something else, a local fixture. Not quite good, not quite bad, but entirely committed to the idea that he was indispensable. His lute was battered, missing a string. His hat was always tilted at an angle that suggested either confidence or head trauma. He called himself Fernin the Fearless, though he feared loud women and hot stew equally. Each night he'd appear from some unknown hole in the floor or rafter, perch himself by the fire, clear his throat with exaggerated ceremony and begin. Some songs were funny. Some were tragic. Some were unintelligible. But he kept playing through groans and cheers alike. He once sang for 5 hours straight during a snowstorm, and no one dared stop him, because it was either that or listen to the wind scream through the shutters. He had enemies. The brewer hated him for rhyming ale with nail and accusing him of using shoe polish in the mead. The tax collector once stormed out in fury after being cast as the villain in a song called The Man Who Stole the Moon. Even the dog disliked him growling whenever Fernin pulled out his lute. But Fernin was persistent. He knew everyone's name. He knew who had lost a bet, who had married badly, who had cried into their porridge last winter, and he wove it all into his songs. People laughed. Sometimes they threw things, but they listened, and that to a bard was enough. One night, though, he pushed too far. He sang about the alewife, a gentle melody, a story of her strength. But then a line slipped in one that made the room inhale sharply. Something about a love long lost and a dagger under the pillow. The alewife didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She simply looked at him, and the silence that followed was colder than the draught from the cellar. Fernin finished the song, slowly, quietly. He packed his lute, bowed, and disappeared for 3 nights. When he returned, he didn't mention where he'd been, but his songs changed, softer, wiser. Less about scandal, more about survival, and he never sang about the alewife again. Still he remained singing, smiling, living dangerously one verse at a time, because in a medieval tavern, words could wound, a melody could start a fight, a rhyme could change your fate. And the bard, for all his flaws, reminded everyone that the greatest dangers weren't always found at the bottom of a mug, but in the space between one verse and the next. Every tavern has one, a place not marked on any map and never spoken of, directly a spot where the firelight dares not reach, and the regulars avoid without seeming to avoid it the darkest corner. It isn't the farthest seat from the hearth, or the coldest patch of stone on the floor, though it might be both. It is the place where things are overheard but never acknowledged, where faces stay in shadow even when candles flicker close. Newcomers don't notice it right away. It hides in plain sight just past the reach of laughter, beyond the glow of spilled ale and rowdy songs. But spend enough nights inside a medieval tavern, and you'll begin to feel it like a cold draught on your neck, or a whisper you didn't quite catch. The darkest corner draws a certain kind of guest. Not the brawlers or the braggarts, not the flirtatious or the desperate, but the silent, the watchful, the ones who know more than they should and speak less than they must. Some come to forget, others to remember, and a few to make sure they are remembered. The tavern's regulars know better than to look directly at that table for too long. You might catch a glint of something sharp under a cloak, or notice that the mug hasn't been touched in hours. Even though it's always full, sometimes a pair of boots sits too still, sometimes a hood stays too low. It's not that the people who sit there are always dangerous, it's that they could be. Once a stranger sat there for 3 nights straight and said nothing. He never ordered, never moved, barely blinked. On the 4th night, the brewer found his coin pouch hanging from the rafters, with every coin still inside and a single raven feather tucked inside. Another time a woman in green silk sat there with a parchment and wrote names slowly, one after another, until the ink ran dry. No one saw her leave. A week later, 3 of those names were nailed to the town's pillory post for crimes no one had known about before. The alewife rarely acknowledged that corner. She served its occupants like any others, but never lingered. If something spilled there, she left it for the broom boy. If someone screamed there, she didn't flinch, because the tavern ran on balance and that corner was part of the price. The bard, brave as he was, never sang toward that wall. His voice always curved around it like wind around stone. He once tried long ago to charm a girl sitting there with a verse. She did not respond. Later, he found a small stone in his boot with a rune carved into it. He didn't understand what it meant, but he stopped trying after that. Sometimes a fight would start in the tavern and sweep toward the corner like a storm, but just before it reached that spot it would stop. Men suddenly remembered they had places to be. The momentum faded like a candle guttering in wind. That space did not like chaos. It tolerated tension but not noise. There was an unspoken rule that even the drunk respected, a strange quiet pact that said, "Leave that place be." Some said it was cursed, others said it was sacred, a place where old gods sat and listened, or where the dead paused for a drink before moving on. One child, too young to know better, wandered there once and tried to play beneath the table. He came back with a ring in his hand and a streak of soot across his cheek that no one could wash off. He never returned to the tavern. Over time, you learn to live with it. You drink your mug, you listen to the bard, you throw your dice. But out of the corner of your eye, you know it's there. Always waiting, watching. And on the nights when the fire burns low and the room grows quiet, when even the dog is silent and the stew has gone cold, you might hear something from that corner. Not a voice, not a sound, but a feeling. Like history breathing, like a secret leaning closer. And if you're wise, you won't look. You'll finish your drink, nod to the alewife, and step out into the night, grateful that whatever sat in the tavern's darkest corner had no interest in you. Not yet. It did not happen often, but when it did, the tavern changed. A noble stepping through the low wooden door of a common drink house was like a wolf wandering into a pig pen, out of place, unexpected, and impossible to ignore. They came rarely, perhaps once in a season, dressed in fabrics too fine for soot and stew, with boots that had never touched mud until that night, and rings that caught the firelight like sparks. Sometimes it was curiosity, a bet, or the thrill of doing something forbidden. Sometimes it was heartbreak, exile, or a sudden fall from grace. Whatever the reason, when a noble sat among the peasants with a mug in hand, it was as though 2 worlds collided under a roof, too fragile to contain either. The regulars did not welcome them, but they did not shun them either. There was a silence. A ripple like the moment before a storm. Conversation slowed. Laughter softened. The bard skipped any songs about taxes or failed crusades. The brewer wiped the counter more often than necessary. The alewife watched closely, saying nothing, reading the room like a book she had already memorized. The noble always tried to blend in at first. They pulled their hood low, or spoke with the rough accent of the countryside, trying to pass as a traveller or a minor merchant. But the illusion never lasted long. It was in the way they held the cup too delicate, or the way they flinched when a chair scraped. It was in the perfume that clung to them, even beneath smoke and sweat. And once they were known, the real game began. Some peasants ignored them, unwilling to risk trouble. Others watched, eyes narrowed, waiting for a slip, a smirk, a word too cruel. A few bolder or drunker tried to provoke them. A joke about rents, a toast to the harvest they never saw. A question about how it feels to feast while others starve. Most nobles bristled. Some left, but a rare few stayed. And those few, the ones who laughed at themselves, who shared their bread and poured drinks for the stranger beside them, earned something greater than respect. They earned stories. One tale told of a baron's daughter who sat all night with the village blacksmith speaking not of gold or gowns, but of fire and metal and broken things made whole again. Another spoke of a young lord who challenged the tavern to a drinking contest and lost spectacularly. Waking up with a turnip carved to resemble a crown upon his head, he paid for everyone's drinks the next night. Of course, not all encounters ended in laughter. Some ended in bruises or exile. One noble once insulted the alewife, just one word careless and sharp. He was gone before the second syllable thrown into the snow with his purse lighter, and his dignity shattered. But even then no one truly hated him. Pity perhaps. He had come to feel something real and failed the test, because that was the truth hidden beneath the low ceiling and smoky air. In the tavern, titles did not matter. Not truly. Everyone drank the same ale. Everyone warmed by the same fire. And if a noble could forget who they were long enough to be just another tired soul, in the corner of a loud room, they might find what their castles never gave them, a moment of peace. A laugh that wasn't measured, a story that wasn't written by scribes, and in the end, when they stood to leave and stepped back into the cold night, perhaps they left behind more than coin. Perhaps they left behind the smallest piece of their armour, a piece they never missed. Because once in a while, when the tavern was loud and the mugs were full and no one could quite remember the names of kings, someone would raise a glass and say, "Remember the night the noble sang with the pig farmer," and for a moment nobody was above or below, just human. There was always a moment quiet and small when the tavern began to fall asleep, a soft unravelling that started with the last mug drained and ended with the slow, fading hum of the fire. The air grew thicker, filled with the scent of old wood sweat and the final breath of the night's laughter. Chairs tilted back onto four legs, dice lay forgotten. The bard had fallen silent, either asleep or pretending to be, and the alewife stood behind the bar, polishing a cup that had been cleaned for an hour. This was the time of last call, not shouted, not declared, but understood. It was the unspoken agreement that whatever had happened tonight stayed here, folded into the smoke-stained beams and worn benches, stitched into the shadows like a dream that would not survive daylight. The last patrons were a strange mix. The drunkest clung to the table as if it might float them home. The loneliest stared into the fire, trying to hold on to something that would slip away with the sun. A few whispered in corners, making promises they wouldn't keep. And some simply sat in silence, not thinking, not feeling, just being. Outside, the wind began to stir, brushing against shutters and stirring the ashes of the day. In some winters you could hear wolves howling. In others, just the distant clang of a blacksmith starting early, or a baby crying in a nearby cottage. But inside there was only stillness, broken occasionally by a soft snore, or the creak of a stool as someone shifted. The tavern so loud just hours before now held its breath. The candles were fewer, flickering low, their wax pooling like time itself. The stew pot was empty, the mugs were stacked. Even the ghosts, if you believed in them, had gone quiet. And in that hush something ancient settled over the room, not fear, not sadness. Something older, like the knowledge that this place had seen countless nights like this, that long before you others had sat here in the same weariness, with the same quiet ache behind the eyes. They had laughed, fought, kissed, wept, lost. They had raised mugs and buried secrets. They had disappeared into history with nothing but a ring scratch on the table, and a name mumbled by someone who couldn't quite remember the face. And yet the tavern remained, the fire still burned, the ale still flowed, the stories still found new mouths. You looked at the others and saw pieces of yourself scattered like crumbs across the wooden floor, a memory here, a regret there, a hope barely clinging to the rim of an empty cup. And as the alewife dimmed the last lantern and the dog curled near the hearth, you felt it, that strange warmth of having shared something fleeting and real with people you might never see again. The door creaked, someone stepped into the cold, another followed a nod, a muttered goodbye. Then you two stood, legs stiff, mind soft, and walked toward the night behind you. The tavern sighed, not with sadness, but with peace. It would wait. It always did, until the next night when the mugs would fill again, and the stories would rise like smoke. But for now it slept, and outside the stars blinked quietly, keeping watch over a world that never stopped needing places like this.